Sally, you can start.
Okay, thank you very much for inviting me to come and speak to you all the way from Paris, ultimately from Chicago. And I'm grateful to Lillian for making all the arrangements and making it possible for me to arrive. Um, this is going to be the background of all the other presentations I'm going to give here in the next few days, next at least 2 weeks. And the title I have given it is Making Sense of the Ecology of Language and Linguistic Ecosystems. Should move on to the next slide. And the notions of ecology and ecosystem are related, but they are sometimes confused in the linguistics literature. Okay. You hear me better now?
Yeah.
Okay. Good, thank you. Okay. Ecology is usually used in the sense of habitat or environment. This part linguists have got it right. And so what I'm going to do is try to explain what kind of ecology matters for languages and how many scales of ecology there are. On the other hand, there's also the notion of ecosystem that is relevant, and that has to do with the community of interacting organisms and their physical environment. You can substitute species for organisms. In my work, I characterize languages as the counterparts of species and not organisms. Because if you use the notion of species, you can account for variation within a language, which people shouldn't overlook. We should always remember that when we speak of languages, we are extrapolating from individual idiolects that are spoken by different people. So we are kind of averaging things. But every now and then we have to come back to idiolects to understand where the action lies for, say, language change or for the endangerment of languages. Because when we communicate linguistically, we don't behave like members of a sports team or members of an army where there are rules of engagement that are clearly articulated. What happens is that we all behave individually when we communicate linguistically in our own interests, and the main interest is to be understood. And we think that we have failed if we are not understood. And when we realize that we are not understood, we try to modify our utterances so that we can be better understood. Well, the notion of environment is particularly useful because, first of all, there is what we can call the direct habitat for language, and that lies in our bodies. Our anatomies are one of the two most direct ecologies for language, and the other one is the mind. And I will talk about this when I talk to you about the evolution of language in mankind. But there's what we can also call indirect ecology, and that is in the society in which we live. And there are a lot of things that go on in society. We want to align with people of the same gender. We want to align with people of the same group. We want to align with people of the same profession. We want to align with people coming from our geographical backgrounds and so forth and so forth. And that is particularly interesting. From an economic perspective, if you look at the history of colonization, a lot of things went on. For instance, why would Brazil be so much invested in sugarcane at the beginning, in the 16th century? Or why would Brazil also become interested in coffee. Do you produce coffee in Brazil?
Yeah.
Okay. And what are the consequences of engaging in uh, sugarcane cultivation or engaging in coffee cultivation? We find differences across the world in terms of population structures that have been generated. And when you look at sugarcane plantations, generally they are not segregated. I'm sorry, the other way around. Generally they are segregated, except in Brazil. Why is Brazil an exception? What kinds of population structures did colonization engender in Brazil as opposed to the Caribbean or to the United States and things like that? So that's why we really have to take the external ecologies quite seriously, or the indirect ecologies quite seriously because they have an impact. And you also find a correlation between different kinds of ecologies. So there's the social ecology, there's the geographical ecology, and they interact with each other, and I'm going to explain all this. Next slide, please. So in biology, there's a group of people called environmentalists that are concerned with the management of resources in an ecosystem. So we don't live on this planet alone, and we share our natural ecology with plants, with animals, and if we don't manage our resources well, we are headed toward chaos. And that's why environmentalists are concerned with the way in which we treat our natural ecologies, our natural environments. We're dealing with pollution, we're dealing with the endangerment of some species, and yet those species can do things that are helpful to us in nature and so forth. Okay. So a clear example is, you cannot see my
I see.
pointer. Uh, I need a pointer to show here. No, don't change the slide. I need to get my phone pointer. I didn't anticipate this kind of arrangement. So I'm going to use my pointer for the screen. So if you look here, for instance, in this particular natural habitat, we see elephants, we see zebras there. I'm sorry, the screen is not that sharp. And we see birds here. And there is an important natural resource that these animals share. That's water. Okay. And the problem here is that you have large animals using more water. And if the pond dries, the people paying the price first are the small ones. On the other hand, when the level of water is so low, it's not adequate enough for the elephants or for the zebras, but for the small birds, they find. Okay? And these animals are all herbivores. They eat grass. And so they feed on the grass around. And who are likely to take the lion's part of the grass is the larger animals. Fortunately, birds can rely on some of the resources and so forth, but there is a kind of balance in the management and consumption of resources that must be struck in order for everybody to survive. If that balance is disrupted, then some of the species are endangered and so forth. And it is from this perspective that we should, for instance, think about the coexistence of languages in a particular population. So if you have a multilingual population, you can compare the different languages to different animal species, try and feeding on people that speak them. or use them if you assign them. Okay? And if one language becomes too powerful, it's usually at the expense of another language. So how do we manage the human resources so that one language doesn't wind up displacing the other languages? Fortunately, we have the capacity for multilingualism. We can use more than one language at different times or in different settings. So how do we address the problems arising from one particular language becoming more powerful than another language? It can become more powerful demographically because there are more and more speakers, politically because the rulers speak that particular language and others don't, and it could become more powerful because economically the language is more powerful. We are there to try to earn a living, and we consider which language is going to give us a better salary, which language is going to make it easier for us to compete in the economic market and so forth. So does it mean that the outcome must be the endangerment of other languages, or can things be arranged in such a way that a person can become multilingual and sustain multilingualism without giving up their heritage language? Okay. So what's the difference between places where multilingualism thrives, such as in Africa, and places like in the Western world where it is multilingualism, becomes a kind of luxury because you can do almost everything in one language. And this is what we have to highlight the significance of the ecological factor that I usually refer to as population structure. If you are a sociolinguist, you may ask me why I don't speak just of social organization. Isn't quite the same thing. With population structure, I gain more miles in talking about whether or not a population is stratified, that's correct. The people that have power versus people that don't have power. Where a population is segregated such that members of a particular ethno-linguistic group lives in one quarter and members of another ethno-linguistic group live in a separate quarter. Whether, for instance, it is the kind of segregation where the poor live in one part of the town and the affluent live in another part of the town, and what are the consequences for all this. And also, whether a population is small or large can make quite a lot of difference regarding the vitality of languages and many other things that will come up that you can find in my work that I usually invoke to explain differences. For instance, why is the endangerment of Native American languages more advanced in North America than it is in Brazil? What has protected indigenous languages in Brazil? So you have to think of the Amazon forest. Okay. And then we'll come to that at some point. When you think of the Amazon forest, you can also think of the consequences of the Amazon forest for the industrialization of Brazil. Nowadays, we can speak of Brazilians penetrating the Amazon forest. Who are the Brazilians who are penetrating the Amazon forest? And why are they penetrating the Amazon forest? The discovery of gold becomes relevant, the discovery of diamond, the discovery of heavier for water becomes informative. And so how does the economy develop? And what kind of economic system can cause the endangerment of languages, and what kind of economic system will not? Okay. So we'll be talking about these kinds of things when we talk about the ecology of language. Next slide, please. My interest in the ecology of language stems from an evolutionary linguistics perspective. I do evolutionary linguistics. This is like people talk about evolutionary biology. It's not just about evolution in the structure of languages, but it is also about evolution in the vitality of languages. We are talking about language invasion and loss on the model of endangered species. We want to understand why some species, animal species, are endangered. We want to understand why some plants become endangered and so forth. And we ought to be able to explain why some languages become endangered, while the same language may be endangered in one place but not in another place. Okay. And I started with Creoles, and we have been traditionally Creoles have been treated as having an exceptional evolution, that they didn't evolve like other languages. Uh, and we wanted to understand what was the difference. Okay. Nowadays, I say Creoles are teaching us how to talk about language diversification. Uh, in my work, I use the term from biology, language speciation, so like the measures of new species. Um, and in the process, changes occur. But we have also usually said Creoles evolved exceptionally because of complex language content. And later on, I tell people, well, look at the mentions of the Romance languages that involve language contact too. Look at English, which is the dominant lingua franca in the world. The origins of English lie in language contact. We have generally misinterpreted the significance of the Stammbaum or cladogram. There's the tree, upside down tree in linguistics that show how you go from one proto-language to so many different languages. And traditionally, people have given us the impression that this evolution is uniparental, involving only one parent. And what I want to show, no, that's not the case, because there have been so many layers of mutual colonization among human populations, and those mutual colonizations have generated language contact. And when you put things in perspective, you find languages that become stronger and languages that become weaker and are displaced. But the languages that become stronger usually win a Pyrrhic victory. That means they are transformed while they prevail. And this is the history of Latin. If you put things in perspective, Latin was taken to the provinces of the Western Roman Empire, and Latin became the dominant language in terms of politics, in terms of economy, and little by little the people and Latin became the lingua franca of the emergent urban centers in Western Europe, and the people that wanted to live traditional life and shift to the Roman style socioeconomic structure, they had to learn Latin. But when they learn Latin, they would be like me speaking English with an accent, or an American speaking Portuguese with an accent and things like that. And when you are in a situation where non-native speakers are the majority population, then everything is ready for the language to change, and these are the kinds of things that have happened. And if my hypothesis is correct, you look at the history of Latin, the Romance languages emerged after the Romans had left the empire. Okay. And then you can push the hypothesis further in the 15th century, the Portuguese led Europe in colonizing the world outside Europe. 50 years later, they would be followed by the Spaniards early in the 16th century. Uh, but what happened in the meantime, as Portuguese was spread to different parts of the world, Portuguese became also different because of contacts with other languages, but also between of contacts among different dialects of Portuguese. In the Spanish colony, it's more or less the same scenario. And then now, to the question or the explanation for the so-called exceptionality of Creoles, the language contact, or what kind of language contact in what particular kind of population structure. Okay. What we have to remember is that although we have not many of these languages that evolved during the last half millennium in places where there was sugarcane cultivation, especially, but not exclusively. We find out that only some of these places produce Creoles, but there are places like Brazil that didn't produce Creole. So Brazil would become an exception within an exception, and I don't know how to handle it. So, but there's a difference between the plantations where non-Europeans became the overwhelming majority of the population and plantations where the enslaved population didn't really become the overwhelming majority of the population. But there are also differences correlated with the size of a sugarcane plantation, like in the Caribbean, versus the size of a sugarcane farm, as in Brazil. Okay. In the 17th century, Brazil was the largest producer of sugarcane, but the system for producing the sugarcane was for producing sugarcane, for growing sugarcane and producing sugar was not the same as in the Caribbean. And these are the kinds of things that we can explain. And in the farms of Brazil, it's not clear whether the enslaved Africans constituted the majority of the population. That's another story. So having a population on a farm of say 30 people versus having a population on a plantation that is 200 or 300 people makes a whole lot of difference. It's on the large plantation that you get this overwhelming majority of non-native speakers of the European language. In a way, I tell people you can verify my hypothesis by going to Africa, which was generally colonized on the exploitation model versus the Americas, generally colonized on the settlement model. And in the settlement colonies, the European populations have become the dominant majority. In the exploitation colonies, the indigenous people have remained the overwhelming majority, and the European populations have always been a minority. And segregation became quite natural in Africa, whereas in the settlement colonies, where people chose segregation, they designed ways of keeping the populations segregated from each other, which accounts for a number of things. And then you follow this, you can come up with some explanations. And this is the advantage of approaching language evolution from an ecological perspective, because you want to find factors outside language that can explain for the ways in which either the structures of languages change or the vitality of the languages also changes. Okay. So have non-Creole colonial varieties of European languages evolved in identical ways? No. because the other outcomes are not the same. But that's the same thing we find with Creoles. We have typically jumped to the conclusion that Creoles have this universal pattern they share among themselves. That is not true. You're going to find variation in the structures of Creoles. I think the common thread of Creoles, which linguists have not admitted, is the race of the speakers. Because linguists claim they are not racist, they are less racist than 19th century colonizers. But there is still a thread of racism or racialization in the way that linguists have discussed things, especially when it comes to Creoles. At some point, I will also highlight, not today, I will highlight the fact that what came with the mentions of Creoles is also language shift. And then language shift is not unique to Africans that came to the New World. You look at different colonial populations here in Brazil, do Italians still speak Italian? People of Italian descent in Brazil, do they still speak Italian? People of German descent, do they still speak German as a vernacular? And these are the kinds of things that we have to bring into the picture in order to understand how things have evolved so variably from one colony to another. So the answer to the questions of whether Creoles have evolved identical grammatical systems or whether non-Creole colonial varieties of European languages have evolved in identical ways, in both cases the answer is negative. Can we simply think of all the above as cases of differential language evolution? In other words, you can have the same species, but you put this members of the same species in different ecologies, and then you will notice that the language has evolved differently. Okay? And this approach, we call it a uniformitarian approach, uniformitarianism. In other words, similar ecological conditions acting on the same species are going to produce more or less similar changes. But if you change the ecological factors, then the changes are also going to become different. And this is important because we can find information in the past that help us understand the present, but we can also find things in the present that can help us better explain the past. It's a two-way street in uniformitarianism. So uniformitarianism can change the picture. Uniformitarianism does not mean that the changes are going to be all the same everywhere. No. If under similar conditions, if it is the same species, that is the same language, there are going to be similar changes, not necessarily identical. And if the ecological conditions vary from one particular colony to another colony, then the outcomes are going to be different. And one afternoon in my office, I had nothing better to do, and I thought I would put on a map where Creoles have emerged and where Fijians have emerged, and Creoles are represented in red. So what you see there, the colors are not the same on my screen as there, and Fijians are blue, intended to be blue on the screen. And what you notice is the striking complementary distribution. Where Fijians emerge, not Creole emerge. With one exception, and that exception would be in Hawaii. I say would be. It is not an exception. Because in Hawaii, despite the fact that Bickerton really brought Hawaiian Creole and Hawaiian Pidgin to the forefront of Creolistic, the conditions for the formation of these varieties in Hawaii are not the same as around the Atlantic or in the Indian Ocean. First of all, Hawaii didn't use slave labor, and the colonization of Hawaii started in the 19th century after the abolition of slavery, by the way, and that is important. And there was an extensive multilingualism in Hawaii, unlike in the colonies of the Atlantic, plantation colonies of the Atlantic and the Indian Ocean. And the labor population, there were contract laborers, were segregated among themselves by nationality. The Chinese that came first, the Japanese, the Koreans, the Filipinos, they lived in different quarters of the plantations. And the contract laborers could bring their families, which the enslaved populations of the Caribbean were not able to do. And so on these plantations, actually, when you put things in perspective, the contract laborers continue to speak the heritage languages. And they got information for work through a foreman. The foreman, who was a kind of supervisor for them, is the one that had to speak English. The others didn't have to. And the people that produced pigeon on the plantations, these are people that cross ethnic boundaries and try to establish communication between them, and they just had so little exposure to English, they had to produce something called pigeon. Whereas in Hawaii, Creole developed in the city. In the Caribbean, in the Indian Ocean, the story is quite different. Creole developed on the plantations. No pigeon developed. In the city, it was closer approximations of the variety that the European colonists spoke. Creole would spread to the city after the abolition of slavery, when the former slaves refused to continue working on the plantations, and they went to look for opportunities in the city. And in the city, they took the Creole with them to the city. So it's really a different kind of story. So in this particular case, Hawaii doesn't contradict the general pattern that you see on my map here. I'm accustomed to having ice cream and cooking the other cream too, but I don't have that option here, so I'm confused occasionally. But this is really what is going on. And later on, I'm going to tell you, guess what? Patients didn't even develop in the ways that we have always thought. It's a different story, and that story, that's a cliffhanger for tomorrow. Okay? But at least when you follow the kind of explanation I'm providing here, then you see the significance of the ecological approach and why I had to work on Creoles first before getting a sense of the ecology of language is and how it impacts the evolution of a particular language. And then when Bickerton started saying that Creoles are telling us how the primordial stages of language started like 300,000 years ago in the evolution of Homo sapiens, and I started contradicting him and disputing his consequences and the consequences of his hypothesis. And then it dawned on me that I have to deal with a different notion, a different interpretation of ecology 300,000 years ago in the phylogeny of mankind. And that is what led me to say the mind is the primary ecology, and the mind colonized the body. to produce the technology that we call language. And I'll tell you more about that tomorrow. Not tomorrow, the day after tomorrow. Okay. So, next slide. Here you get a messy map of the Western European expansion around the world since the 15th century. I call it the second wave of Indo-European dispersal. There is a third wave, and the third wave is the penetration of the rainforest in the Amazon. There's a third wave of colonization, of the spread of Indo-Europeans after the bulldozer have been invented, and you can now make roads in the rainforest, and you can now go and dig gold or diamond, or you can now go into the rainforest to harvest heavier, agriculture, produce heavier plantations, and then produce rubber and so forth. So what I want to highlight here is interdependencies between technology, means of transportation, and the spread of populations and what consequences they have. One thing I also wanted to show in this map, although it is not so easy to see, so this is Brazil and this is Spanish Americas, and there's North America there. But I try to make the colors different, like this is a darker green and this is a lighter green in Angola, because the functions of Portuguese in Brazil and in Angola have not been the same. In Angola, Portuguese is a lingua franca, whereas in Brazil, Portuguese is a vernacular. So different kinds of Portuguese have developed, aside from the fact that the contacts here were also stratified and conditioned by the school system, whereas here it's more by immersion that you get the spread of Portuguese. Same thing for French. In New France, most of which has been lost now, thanks to the Louisiana Purchase, but the French that is spoken in Quebec is not like the French that is spoken in Africa, because French in Quebec has to remain a vernacular, and French in Quebec is spoken in an environment where the speakers are primarily descendants of the French population in France, whereas here it's more reminiscent of the provinces of the Roman Empire, where Latin was brought, and then Latin was appropriated as the language of business, language of administration, and so forth. And then centuries later, it would become the vernacular. And if you follow the history carefully, it took several centuries after the Romans had left before the Romance languages could really develop. If you want to hear more heresies, I will say there was no such thing as all Portuguese or all Spanish or all French or whatever. We just see a gradual evolution until some of the Neo-Latin varieties displace the weaker Neo-Latin varieties, the urban varieties prevail, and so forth, and then among the regional varieties, one variety becomes dominant, and so forth. But that is a different kind of history. So here we learn why it is useful to have an ecological approach, because the ecological approach, first of all, prompts you to ask tough questions that traditional historical linguistics has not dealt with. Tough questions that traditional genetic linguistics has not dealt with. And you want to find answers. And if you are a uniformitarian, who said, now that I think I understand what went on in the recent history, can I also explain what went on in the more time in history? And this, I think, is what I've been trying to explain. And you get, again, this two-way street, because when you focus on the Roman Empire, there will be questions specific to the Roman Empire, and you want to understand whether those questions also apply to uh, the more recent history. Or there are things that we observe now, and you want to find out if there is a correlate for them. If there are correlates for them in the different parts. Okay. Next slide. So there are certain things that can be correlated to the following distinction. So we have trade colonies, and the trade colonies are where the Europeans were not really interested in taking control of the land. Actually, they were at the mercy of the indigenous rulers, who were their trading partners. And I will tell you the fuller history tomorrow. Okay? And that is where pigeons developed. But as I said earlier, for reasons different from what we have always learned in linguistics. And then there are the settlement colonies. And for the settlement colonies, we have to make a distinction between those colonies where European people of European descent have become the dominant majority, and those places where people of non-European descent have become the dominant population. And generally, in both cases, the indigenous populations have either been exterminated, like in the Caribbean, or the indigenous populations have been reduced to a very, very minority, like in Latin America, in the Americas in general. Okay. And then came the exploitation colonization of Africa and Asia. It was a kind of afterthought. And the reason is the American Revolution. And this revolution was followed by other movements of independence throughout the Americas. But this coincided with the emergence of the Industrial Revolution. And Europe couldn't rely on the former settlement colonies anymore for raw materials. Now they had to colonize Africa, and they colonized it on a different model. Okay, they remain minorities, but they were more interested in raw materials coming from Africa. They were very little interested in communicating regularly with the indigenous people. And later on, I'll tell you, Africa and Asia were colonized through interpreters. And we call them colonial auxiliaries. Talk about it. But there are hybrid or mixed styles, such as in South Africa and in Zimbabwe. Part of the colonization is on the exploitation model, but there's also part of the colonization on the settlement model. And this can explain why there have been fights in Zimbabwe for the control of land. The settlers that claim, European settlers that claim vast expanses of land as theirs. And Mugabe that said, no, that's unjust, that those lands, swaths of land belong to the indigenous populations and you have to return them and so forth. And there's also the colonization of South Africa, where the Dutch, now known as Afrikaners, settled. And they chose the term Afrikaner in the late 18th century or early 19th century to distinguish themselves from other Europeans from different parts of Europe, especially from the United Kingdom that came to colonize the land, but they came to colonize the land on the exploitation model. So the English or the British colonized both the Dutch, the Boers or Afrikaners, and the people identified now as Bantu instead of Africans in that particular regime. And, and so the Afrikaners had to fight for uh, to be separated politically from the blacks and had different kinds of rights until in 1948 they got a chance to rule the land and they set in place the apartheid system. And then we have the legacy of all that, and we can understand things as we reconstruct that particular history. And then we're going to find native speakers of English as heritage language in South Africa, but not in West Africa. Okay, next. So colonization generated new population structures. Trade colonies produced world concessions called trade forts, trade fortifications, and they produce patients immediately. The patients would develop later. So traditionally, people have said patients develop when trade started. The history I'm going to tell you tomorrow is that it wasn't like that. The trade proceeded through brokers that functioned as interpreters. And the vast majority of Africans were not interested in learning the European language because they had to save themselves first from being enslaved. So that's a different story. And then settlement colonization are associated with dispossession of land from native populations, the later assimilation of European populations, and the segregation and marginalization of non-Europeans. That's the general path, but things vary. The model that I presented here is mostly inspired by North America, but if you come down to Central America and South America, things are changed, and you have to explain things differently, except for the dispossession of Native Americans from their land. So, and that is another story. So plantation settlement colonies were segregated early and produced what we call Creoles. Other colonies produced new colonial varieties of European languages. However, didn't I tell you of race? People have focused so much on African American English as if it were a unique case. People don't talk that much about Amish English, where, like the Africans, these Europeans, I think from Austria, shifted languages from German to English, and they have been living in a segregated way by choice, whereas African Americans have been living in a segregated way, but as a result of Europeans, not people of European descent, not wanting to live together with people of African descent. But in both cases, the populations have developed their own varieties of English that are different from other varieties of American English, but the focus has been typically on African American English, and there are people like John Home that came and spent some time here in Brazil and came up with the idea of semi-Creole and thought that African American English should be called a semi-Creole. How he could measure it, only he knows. Okay. So exploitation colonies produce what we call indigenized varieties of the European languages. And this means that because they practice the European language, especially after independence, mostly among themselves, to bridge different ethno-linguistic communities, but also to work in the administration of the countries and in the government and so forth. The natural evolution of things led to what we call indigenization. And in my subversion, I underscore it, I say, well, after all new varieties are indigenized because indigenization means becoming indigenous to a territory and being adapted to the new ecology of language practice. So we can really reopen things and explain them differently, and this is part of my decolonial agenda. And since I come from a former exploitation colony, if you accuse me of coming in this with some vengeance, that's true. Because there are alternative ways of explaining things, and people shouldn't be talking about us Africans as being incapable of learning the European languages perfectly. Guess what? The Europeans never spoke our languages perfectly either. So I told you about world settlements. There are many of them on the coast. There were many of them on the coast of Africa, and you find them also along on the coast of the Indian Ocean and so forth. And the activities that took place in there, pointing here, the activities that took place in here, um, they will explain why pigeons didn't emerge in the early stages of colonization. And my hypothesis is that at best, as far as Africa is concerned, they emerged in the late 18th century or early 19th century, but not sooner. And Creoles may actually have Creoles appear to have evolved early, to have emerged earlier than pigeons, which means we can continue saying Creoles are nativized pigeons because that was not the scenario. First of all, the map that I showed you doesn't support this, but people would say, well, that's because in the places that were shown in red, and the pigeons had already changed into Creoles, and I would say no, because the ecologies of interaction were different and the outcomes were not the same. So this is what you find in Asia and on the east coast of Africa, but I will focus mostly on these communities around India, okay, the Indian subcontinent, and then you go to Malaysia, and then you go all the way to Macau. And what is interesting is that in all these places you find the same world communities that I illustrated earlier. And in these world communities, mostly the Portuguese, but also the Spaniards in the case of the Philippines and some islands in the Pacific. And they live with single indigenous ethno-linguistic communities that converted to Christianity. But part of the acculturation was also shifting languages to the language of power, which is Portuguese, and they became a kind of non-European new Portuguese in the region. It's like forming new ethno-linguistic groups, the kind of thing that we don't often talk about. And many of these people travel with Portuguese passports. Okay, and there was an extensive multilingualism. Of course, the Portuguese they speak is different because by the 18th century, the Portuguese lost their colonies, and the language of business became either English or French or Dutch, and therefore these people either have to give up Portuguese altogether, or they continue to speak Portuguese, but they have to form new alliances with the other indigenous populations, and more substrate influence crept in, and the varieties became different. But doesn't this sound like how Latin became so many Romance languages after the Romans had left? And the people were left among themselves, but they wanted to keep the language of the former colonizer. And in the process, the language was influenced by primarily Celtic languages and became different. And then later on, contact with, say, Arabic would influence a little bit of Spanish and Portuguese, influence contact with the France in France would influence the evolution of Latin there into several varieties of French and so forth. So the histories are quite similar. Here I'm using again the ecological approach to ask similar questions in both cases of colonization and raise the question, what other than the race of speakers justifies calling these Asian varieties Creoles? After all, these were not plantations. There were settlements for trade. That's all. There were no plantations that developed there. So these are things that we have to look into. Can we move to the next slide, please? So pigeons can be associated with non-settlement plantation colonies, primarily in the Pacific. But there is also another story where we can trace the spread because the varieties of pigeons spoken there are all English and in the Pacific. And we can trace all this to the colonization of Australia, where an indigenous variety developed there earlier, and then the people that spoke English or some English were taken to the plantations of Queensland in Australia. And then from Australia, we would see the colonization of many islands for plantations. And some of the same workers that had worked in Australia, in Queensland, were taken to these places. So if we believe in monogenesis, here you have a good example. This is something that can be verified, of course, and the documentation is not so full, so extensive, but we get an idea of what went on there. And all those pictures developed in the 19th century. And they seem, it's interesting, they seem to be a peculiarity of English colonization, because we have no trace of any Portuguese fiction anywhere around the world. We have no documentation of any Spanish fiction anywhere around the world, and the few varieties that have been identified as French pigeons actually developed in either the late 19th century or in the early 20th century. So something leaks in our traditional approach to pigeons and Creoles. We are learning something here. So overall, we are dealing just with differential language evolution. If we pull out race, we won't have any more justification for calling some varieties Creoles, pigeons, or whatever. Okay. And
If you want to make a break, it's okay.
yes, thank you. How long have I been speaking?
1 hour.
About an hour, okay. Let me just go through this slide. So the pigeon associated with trade is really Chinese pigeon English. But when we go and look closely, in Guangzhou, where the English traded with the Chinese, it was just like in Africa. Chinese rulers or Chinese merchant guild, the Chinese merchant guild, a kind of franchise of traders with the English merchants, and the English merchants were companies. They were not individuals, which underscores the role of brokers. It's like Ford company bringing work to Brazil, and Ford cars are produced here, but the CEO of the Ford company doesn't have to know Portuguese. And the people that operate in the factories here to produce Ford cars don't have to speak English. Somewhere things are bridged by these brokers. Or Microsoft selling computers in Brazil. Uh, Bill Gates doesn't have to speak Portuguese. The present CEO of Microsoft doesn't have to speak Portuguese. You need the brokers that go and do the job for you, and you better trust them. And sometimes they even have to trust them, but that's another story. Okay. And so in this context, the people that served as the brokers were very much invested in speaking the language well. And in the case of China, we see Chinese coming to the United States or to the UK to learn English before they could return home and function as brokers. So how did pigeons emerge? Parallel economy. So it's like those places where you go and start mining business. So you are invested in mining, but what do you know? Later on, somebody comes and puts in place a convenience store where the workers can buy other things that they need. Somebody comes and sets up a liquor store because at the end of the day, workers want to drink something. Somebody realized that these are all men. They can be satisfied in other ways, for prostitution kicks in. And this is the context in which Chinese speaking English developed. And there was another factor. There are the monsoon seasons. For half the year, the ships sail in one direction, and the other half of the year, they sail in the other direction. So there were about 6 months of idling. And your ship may be full with commodities, but you cannot go because if you go against the direction of winds, there are more chances of wreck, and you want to avoid this. So how do you spend your idling time? I explained it already. And it's in this context that pigeon emerged in Guangzhou. And later on, I'm going to say you can apply the same model to all these other factories, especially trade fortifications that were built on the coast, where the parallel economy would produce these varieties. Later on, I'm going to say, well, it was not even that way for Nigerian Pidgin English or Cameroon Pidgin English. It's another story because these varieties are offshoots of Creole in Sierra Leone. Okay, so there is a whole lot in history that we can learn from. Okay, it is remarkable that not Pidgin English or English Pidgin developed in India, and yet the British East India Company was so big and powerful. And guess what? The British East India Company traded in Persia or Arabic. but not in English. It's in the 19th century that they developed a particular policy of teaching English to the children of the elite class that could interface between the majority population of the colonized population and the Europeans. Okay? So colonization proceeded through interpreters just like exploitation colonization. So we're going to have a break here, and after the break we can continue. How long will the break be?
20 minutes.
Okay? See you in 20 minutes.
Gente, então a gente vai fazer um intervalo de uns 20 minutos. Eu sei que algumas pessoas podem ter alguma dúvida de tradução, aí a gente pode conversar no café. Posso fazer um resumo também para quem teve dificuldade com o inglês. Tem um café ali atrás, a gente pode fazer isso agora.
Não, é pessoal caminho. As pessoas do YouTube não esqueçam de otimista, ela é perfeccionista. Às vezes, vocês fazem.
What is
Hot tea. You like the hot tea?
Can you find ice cream?
Yes, I can find. I will try. No, I will try. She's trying to find active.
I'm just sorry that it's here.
That's fine. When I was there, you can read.
Especially my maths don't read. I don't know how she controls it.
Let me try this. Not working.
Maybe she's switched it up. But you see that it's sharp on my screen. So you have to go in there to the you have to go there. Keep going. Keep going. Keep going. Keep going. Keep going. Sorry, one thing that was now you can reverse it. You have to go. Okay.
Yeah, this one.
Yeah, keep going. This is very good.
Here.
I don't need it. Make sure it's on the same page.
Okay.
But what she has here
It's I'm gonna say it's on YouTube.
is different. It's so
Oh, okay. Hi. Combo na. Guy, meu Deus, ele respondeu. I was trying to make sure you say this. But you should not say anything else. I have a very good friend in Unity. And he comes from Congo. His name is Alain Kakola. And I told him, I have this professor. I want to say him one sentence in Lala. Yeah, then it's say, that's why
That's nice meeting you. I'm Sabio. I'm from the English department here. It's a great pleasure to meet you with us.
Thank you.
You are a good name for us. It's such a pleasure to have you here. I don't know if you remember, but I'm a good friend of Rajago Palana. I don't know if you remember Rajago Palana from India. He lives here. Also, he said he met you. So I told him that I was coming. He met you somewhere. Yeah. I was gonna, when you mentioned, I lived in Hawaii. And I could notice, said, because they still use, even at university, I did my postdoc, even at university, they still use, they make the difference between Hawaiian English, and Pidgin. So they still use the name Pidgin, which is, well, I didn't have a chance to, I was exposed to Pidgin, but not as much as I wanted, but I could notice that there's a lot of English interference or English content. Yeah.
I didn't even exactly the name. I was in Hawaii for a few days.
You were in Honolulu, so then you went to Manoa.
Yeah, yeah.
Yes, that's right. So yeah. Yes, yes. I remember that they even have, I met a professor that he taught Pidgin, and he wrote Pidgin, or what they call Pidgin. And then even emails. There was a lot of people see that was it was something very interconnected with English. Even if you don't speak Pidgin, you could have an idea what they're talking about.
Yeah, if you are familiar with most standard,
Yeah.
it's even easier.
Yeah.
Because the lexicon
Yeah. Yes. But I was also going to tell you, I don't know if you mentioned of course, the Japanese, the Chinese, the Filipino, and the Koreans. But I also met people from the Azores that came to Hawaii, and I saw a lot of names. And my last name is Felipe, and I met a didn't tell why. And then I asked her, where did you come from? And she said, we came from the Azores. And also, Portuguese is
Portuguese, but the Portuguese were previously so they didn't exert
from Puerto Rico, right? Yeah. Yeah.
What people forgot
Even found out that I don't know if you remember the ukulele, the instrument is a Portuguese instrument. So they were the ones who introduced the music. That's what they say. They introduced the instrument, the string instrument to the Hawaiian music through the ukulele that was cooking for the Azores. Yeah, but it's interesting. And then when you mentioned so this segregation, I still had, well, as a foreigner from a totally different environment, but I could feel, for example, this segregation and this social differences in Honolulu, where I live.
all those things
Yes, yes, yes. And you could clearly see, for example, I think my perception, though I was not studying, it says Japanese is the second language. Then we have Korean, and then we have, of course, the Filipinos. But the Filipinos are segregated because they all the jokes and everything they want to use as a bad example, they use the Filipinos. Yes, exactly. So then even though at university I remember that there was a big problem there because they wanted to to eliminate a few courses in the Philippines. It was the one that people really went to learn to fight, not to learn Filipino because of course Japanese is strong, Korean is strong. Chinese is strong, but then Filipino was probably the first one to say, hey, let's dump it. But then our colleagues made it very strong against the Filipino courses. So, but you can clearly see this. For example, radio, you have TV channels, and also religious manifestations. You can see things are very, very clearly separated. So you have the Japanese area, the Korean area, and the Filipinos.
of course, so the place and I noticed the layers of
Probably they were different. Yeah. Believe it or not, even today, you can see this in the tourism industry. Of course, the majority of the tourists, you can say Americans in general, but then the second one, Japanese. So it's funny because you walk around, for example, the beach area in Honolulu, you have pamphlets in English and in Japanese. And then you have specific trolleys and specific buses just for Japanese groups. So they still exercise a lot of power in it. Yeah. And of course, it traces back to Pearl Harbor and all of that. But even so,
but they want to erase
they want to erase it. To visit Sure. Because the pineapple industry is larger now, right? Yeah, 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 yeah. And also, of course, they have the probably remember the Hawaiian cookies. So this big industry, they have coffee, so they have the Kona coffee industry, which is still they have the beer is still there. It's about Kona also. Kona is a city. It's one of the cities in Hawaii, the Big Island. Did you go to the Big Island? Honolulu, Maui. Uh, wow. Yeah. It's a big city, yes. Yeah. Oh yeah, from one place to the other. Yeah, yeah. But you can see this division is still very clear. Very clear. And also another thing became very and of course, the Hawaiians, the indigenous people, right? So, Polynesian. Yeah. So the invention when we speak of Hawaiian invention, keeping that the most violent of the population, but they don't democratize it. Why have they choose to be such a minority? And sometimes I had the feeling there that people would see all that. Of course, in the American side, that they would try to hide that all that history behind what was done and also the we that stayed there in prison. So she was put all the but of course the indigenous people, so the Hawaiians, they really try to keep this tradition and say, hey, we are a minority, but we still keep we want to keep our territory. And then they do this through, of course, they take advantage of the cultural heritage, the music, and they use the touristic industry to take advantage of that. Right? But if you go to the hotels, for example, you see most lower, all the staff that came in, most of them are it's and they speak very from themselves. I remember I was there before too, and you could see this. Even though you stayed there for a few days, but you didn't notice that. But it's still very visible. Okay, I'll let you. You don't want to cut So are you spending this time? Is this because you left Chicago when it's cold, right? I'm spending so you want to sabbatical. No, sabbatical. This year the academic director of the University of Chicago. I have a range there. Yeah, that's nice.
And yeah, I think what's good when I like that feeling of the customer. So it's like just behind so after you see it's like really here because there are sitting and there is a okay, so yeah, now because you don't and so I
So, vamos começar novamente, então. Passar a palavra para a nossa.
Okay, welcome back. So you are already familiar with this map, and what is evident from it and consistent with all the explanation that I have given so far is that where pigeons emerge, no creoles emerge, and where creoles emerge, no pigeons emerge, and even in Hawaii that is really the case. So settlement colonization reminds us of how English was born and England became Anglophone. Because in the 5th century, when the Germanic tribes crossed the channel to colonize England, I like using the term colonize literally, and kind of universally in all these cases, so that you can see similarities and differences. At the time when the different Germanic tribes, the Angles and the Saxons, crossed the channel, there was no English language. we have to wait for about 2 centuries in the 7th century for a language that has been identified by experts as Old English emerged. But when you think about what happened, there was competition between Saxon, Atlantic, and I forgot the name now. But anyway, and they coexisted. They coexisted actually regionally, and by the 7th century, this language emerged, and it's not so much of Anglo. When you think about it, English seems to have evolved from English, the way the Angles speak. Anglo, ironically, it sounds like the Angles claim what we call England today as the land of the Angles. Okay? It's like the English calling themselves Americans in the United States, and everybody else was not American. Native Americans became foreigners in their own land. And this is the experience of the Celts in England. Okay? And the colonizers imposed their language. And what is interesting is that the Jutes and the Saxons eventually shift to the language of the Angles. That's how I like telling the story. And so we often have references to Anglo-Saxons. That's because they merged into one group at some point. When I don't know, people doing the history of English can use the model to come up with more fleshed out explanations. But this is really very similar to what we find here in the settlement colonies. Okay. How Proto-Indo-European speciated is a similar story. One version says that Proto-Indo-Europeans came from Anatolia, where Turkey is. It's not the only explanation. Actually, genetics now disputes that explanation, but I won't get into it. But if we assume that there was one language that we can call Proto-Indo-European, how could it have become so many different Indo-European languages? And we can interpret the first wave of the Indo-European dispersal from supposedly Anatolia as a form of colonial expansion. And during the colonial expansion, the Proto-Europeans came in contact with different populations speaking different languages. They didn't kill them, but the languages of the populations whose lands they invaded influenced Proto-European. And from the contact of Proto-European with the more indigenous European languages where the Indo-Europeans dispersed, we get these new language varieties. And when you follow the story, actually it becomes more complex, because there is a time when the Indo-Europeans colonized each other. That's typically the story. I don't have the map here, I have it somewhere else, but you get the impression that the Celts, as Indo-Europeans, got to different parts of Europe before everybody else. And then at some point, the Greeks colonized some Indo-European populations. But Greek was not as successful as Latin. So we don't really have a significant group of Hellenic languages to talk about. But the Romans colonized Celtic and non-Celtic languages. And people in the colonies accepted Latin in the same ways that we in Africa and Asia have accepted some European languages as official languages, languages of the white-collar sector of the economy. And in the process, the European languages have indigenized, just like Latin indigenized in the provinces. And so what we would find later in the colonies is like a consequence of the second wave of the European dispersal with similar consequences. Okay. And it's the same story with Chinese. The Chinese didn't live everywhere in China where they are now. The Semitic populations expanded southwards and westward to a point where they reduced non-Semitic languages to the status of minority languages. And you put this in perspective, there are several varieties of Semitic languages which by some sort of logic suggest that if there was a Proto-Semitic, it came in contact with non-Semitic languages and it diversified. That's why how we can explain, roughly how Cantonese, Hakka, Hokkien, and these different varieties emerged. And nowadays, there's a kind of competition between Mandarin and other Semitic varieties, and Mandarin really spreading, and other speakers of other Semitic languages have to learn Mandarin as a second language, and we don't know how many people are really shifting to Mandarin as a vernacular. Generations later, people will know what the consequences are. In other words, things are really proceeding here on the model of what I have presented so far from an ecological approach. By contrast, exploitation, colonization reminds us of the emergence of the Romance languages, and that I have told you already. Though in this case, it is the non-scholastic variety of Latin, vulgar Latin, that prevailed, and that is very interesting. It's also noteworthy that in the case of Creoles, it is non-standard varieties of the European languages that prevail and not the standard varieties. And part of it, we owe it to some sort of selection, because it is not necessarily the elite class that was sent to the colonies to start the colonies. And I talk of founder effect, founder population in language evolution in the colonies. And the standard variety of Latin eventually disappeared, because by the time vulgar Latin had indigenized and spoken by substantial segments of the population, at some point in the 18th century, European scholars realized the need to write in the languages of the people, and not in a language that is exotic, Latin, with no native speakers in the former provinces of the Roman Empire. And the difference with Africa is that in Africa, the European languages spread mostly through schools. And what we learn are school varieties of European languages, and Europeans make fun of us when we speak the languages in Europe, say, hey, you speak bookish French or literary French, that's not vernacular French, for a good reason. Well, you never taught us vernacular French, you taught us bookish French, and then you say, now you can use it and communicate. What do you expect? That's natural evolution. So what we see here is history repeating itself in support of uniformitarianism, which does not mean that the changes will be the same everywhere, just what I explained earlier before the break. However, we must also explain why England became Germanic, but not Romance. put it in perspective, the Romans left the Roman Empire in the 5th century at the same time. But southwestern Europe became Romance, but England didn't. And what is also interesting is that both England and southwestern Europe was invaded by Germanic populations. The Franks for Gaul, the Angles, the Jutes, and the Saxons for England, and the Visigoths for Iberia. And later on, in the case of Iberia, here came the Muslims in the 8th century all the way to the 15th century. This is particularly interesting. And these are the kinds of things that can explain that uniformitarianism works along with ecology, under the pressure of ecological factors. And the ecological factors are going to explain why the evolutions were not identical. And what happens in England is that the colonizers imposed the language, whereas in the case of Gaul and Iberia, the new colonizer, the invaders shifted to the local languages. The Franks shifted to Latin, the Visigoths shifted to Latin, and eventually the Muslims came to colonize Iberia, but the Muslims kept Arabic for themselves and allowed the indigenous population to keep speaking the emergent varieties of Romance, but they influenced it. Although Arabic functioned as the language of scholarship rather than Latin. And this is very interesting. So if you don't know the contact history, there are many things that we cannot explain clearly. However, we must, I have to shift to this. So these are pictures that illustrate the migrations. So here we have the Jutes, the Angles, and the Saxons, how they invaded, and you see the Angles at the north. What is interesting is that the Angles language would prevail and displace the competition from Europe, from continental Europe, but there were Celtic languages spoken here. But it will take several centuries before the Celtic languages are gone or endangered. Like Ireland, we have to wait until the 17th century before English is really implemented in Ireland, and it will take up to the 20th century before Ireland is predominantly Anglophone and Irish is seriously endangered, and those kinds of things. And this is what I told you about the Indo-European dispersal, what happens. The map that I didn't include is the map that would show layers of mutual colonization among Indo-Europeans. And here is the map of Semitic dispersal. They come from there and come to the center, and they spread again in several layers, and eventually they move west. But guess what? This is how people of my ancestry also spread, the Bantu people. Areas that have been inhabited by the Pygmies and by the Khoi and Sans, we the Bantu people spread since about 4,000 years ago and have become the dominant population in the region. And the Bantu languages have prevailed. And my theory is you cannot really explain why there are over 500 Bantu languages over 500 Bantu languages without invoking the contact of the Bantu populations with the Pygmies, and the Pygmy languages are gone, and with the Khoi and San people, and the Khoi and most of the Khoi and San languages are gone. But then later on, the Europeans would come and colonize us. But they didn't display European languages, they didn't displace the indigenous languages in Africa. And so these are interesting things that we have to explain. So it could be settlement, colonization all over, but the style in which you implement that colonization matters too. It matters whether your colonization style is culturally assimilationist or not culturally assimilationist, whether you are tolerant of diversity or not tolerant of diversity. These are the kinds of things that we have to pay attention to. This next slide. So some critical ecological factors, population size and population structure. But you have to periodize history. Not everybody arrived at the same time. And the people that come later may have less of an effect than the people that came earlier. And this you can tell, for instance, by the way colonial language varieties emerged. Since the first people to move to settle the colonies spoke non-standard varieties of European languages. It's in the colonies that you are really going to get an idea of what particular varieties the colonies really spoke, brought from Europe. And when you go to Europe, you have to go to rural areas to see what particular non-standard varieties have survived. And the Spanish Commission, I know there is a debate here, there has been a debate here in Brazil about whether Brazilian Portuguese reflects influence from African languages, or whether Brazilian Portuguese has kept a strong legacy of non-standard Portuguese spoken in the, especially 16th through the 18th century. And these are the kinds of things that we have to look into. You have to look into the mode of language transmission and the nature of the variety being transmitted. I have spoken about the nature of the variety being transmitted, and I have also alluded to whether the language is being transmitted by just natural interaction and socialization with the other groups, and therefore we said the language is acquired by immersion. Acquiring the language by immersion does not mean that you reproduce it faithfully. We notice this with children. The children are born in our families and they acquire the language by immersion, and you would say they would produce perfect replications of the languages of their parents, and they don't. There is no child that is a replica of either the mother or the father. And the child comes with their own idiom. You want to understand hybridization, look at the child. We use hybridization, look at the child, and the child fashions their own variety. And plus the interactional histories are not the same. Since language acquisition is incremental, you can see what this is. Okay, so, and the communities produce feature pools of features coming from everywhere. And in the feature pools, you notice competition and selection. And what are the factors that influence selection in this competition? These are things that you have to pay attention to. And you have to look into the language function, whether the language introduced to the new population is functions as a vernacular or as a lingua franca. It makes a whole lot of difference. As a vernacular, you use it on a day-to-day basis. And this is basically the case for Creoles. And as a lingua franca, this is basically the case for pigeons. You don't have to use it on a day-to-day basis, only on the occasions where you have to communicate with people from the other background. Was language shift involved or only an additional language was learned? In the case of Creoles, language shift was involved. In the case of Pidgins, language shift was not necessarily involved, although now that a number of Pidgins have been working as vernaculars, and we call them to figure out what kinds of constraints our Homo sapiens ancestors, roughly 300,000 years ago, started to develop embryonic forms of what would evolve into the language that we speak. You start with the fact that there must have been a lot of ecological pressure to communicate with one another. This is at a time when larger agglomerations of populations emerge, and it is necessary to have more cooperation. And in order for this, a smile is not enough, pointing is not enough. You must name different individuals, you must name different objects, you must name different animals, you must name different things in nature. And you must be able to tell the other person, I'll come hunting with you, or I will not come hunting with you. And you cannot do this with gestures. You must plan how you are going to do things. So somehow, and here I'm talking of language as technology by self-domestication. The mind gets in control and decides what parts of our anatomy we are going to use in order, the people are going to use in order to communicate more explicitly, but also in noisy environments. So you need a kind of technology that is resistant to noise. So a high fidelity mode of communication, not perfect, but with a certain amount of fidelity. You notice you can be in a noisy environment and somebody is talking to you. You kind of shut down everything else that you don't want to hear, and you pay attention to what the person is trying to tell you. Okay. And you look at the human anatomy, it could have been any part of the anatomy. When I was a child, we used to play by moving our armpits and producing noise, especially in the water. But that doesn't go very far. How many different sounds can you produce by just playing with your armpits? You want something that enables you to produce a wide range of sounds. And here we are similar to birds. And birds do it with melodies. Okay. And bird songs are compositional, like human utterances are compositional. That is very interesting. Here we go along with birds rather than with other mammals, although other mammals also produce vocalization, but they haven't controlled the vocalization the way we do. This is part of the domestication, realizing we can produce sound. Somebody must have realized that while we produce the vibrations in the larynx, we can also use the mouth to modify the way the sounds are going to come out like. And we didn't have to invent anything new, we had to follow the natural motions of the mouth and the tongue and the teeth when we masticate food. So we move jaws when we speak, we move the tongue when we speak, in the same way that we use jaws when we masticate food and the tongue to push the food down and then it goes down to the stomach. This is all important. Just the same organs, we co-opted them for the production of speech. And then we make a distinction between speech and language, because you use the sounds produced in speech to develop morphemes, to develop sentences and things like that. I'm not going to go into those details, but you can see what happens. But what happens if you cannot hear, if you are deaf? Then I don't think lip reading is really the most useful thing. You want something that you can interpret more easily. And so I assume our societies were just egalitarian, you use your hands. But the hands are largely articulators. If you structure your language with hands, in the same way that you structure your language with the mouth and whatever, all the speech organs, you're going to be a slow speaker. A slow signer, I'm sorry. You are going to be a slow signer because it takes so much space, and we can produce, I don't know, about 20 sounds in 1 second or something like that. You couldn't do it with your hands. So you have to figure out a different kind of architecture in using your hands for signing. And so we shouldn't expect sign languages to have the same kind of architecture as spoken languages, because the organs used to produce language are not the same. And the organs impose their own constraints on how we develop language. Then I started making sense. I could extend the ecological approach to the evolution of language, and I'll talk about that in a couple of days, but subject to constraints imposed by the material that you use. The example that I usually give my students involve making a chair. So you can make a chair with wood, and you can make a chair with wicker, and now you can make a chair with plastic. And what you're going to find out is the wood imposes constraints. You cannot just curve wood. You need another machine to transform the wood so that you can curve it. But with a wicker, you can't curve it. And you don't attach the parts necessarily with strings. For chairs, you need kind of nails to do this. For wicker, you don't need nails. You just need, strings to attach the different parts. And so that means that the material you use imposes constraints on what you want to produce and what kinds of shapes you can produce. And we can extend it to music. The same song, but different instruments. You are not going to play the song the same way. So if you use a guitar, it comes out one way. If you use a harmonica, it comes out a different way. If you use an accordion, it's going to come out the same way. The instrument imposes constraints. This is how we can understand what is going on here. Okay. And so I couldn't help thinking differently about language vitality and thinking of language as technology. I can see resilience in using the technology, but I can also see situations where I compare the advantages that my technology have brought me versus what another technology was me. If my language isn't going to help me earn good wages, if my language is not going to help me find the right jobs in the new socioeconomic structure, what choice do I have? Well, the first choice is that I learn the other language without giving up my language. But if the population structure changes to where I interact more with people speaking the other language than with people speaking my own language, then my own language falls into attrition. And so, in other words, there are no populations out there that say, from now on, I don't speak my heritage language anymore, I prefer the other. What happens is that if you understand language shift, you find yourself in a situation where you function more and more in the other language, and your language falls into attrition. If you want to remedy the situation, the solution doesn't lie in telling the people the people whose languages are endangered, hey, speak your language more. They cannot speak their language more if you don't provide them with more opportunities to practice the language. And you want to do it unless you associate the language with the same kinds of benefits provided by the other language that they have been shifting to. This is what people did in Quebec. They empowered French economically, and French became competitive with English, and French in Quebec has been revitalized. You take Louisiana, it didn't happen, and French is contracting, receding, it will disappear. And you take Irish, people decided to teach it in school, but the economy of Ireland is operating in English. So it has not changed the danger for Irish. Irish remains a danger. And then you go to Africa, you find a different situation. Only the white collar sector functions in the European language. Everything else functions in indigenous languages. Modern economy is underdeveloped in Africa. And people are aware of the fact that they can, even if they learn French or English or whatever, they don't really earn a living in it. So there is no particular reason why they should give up their indigenous languages. And the kind of segregation that was instituted by European colonizers, where the European colonizers lived in their own separate quarters, and the rest of the population lived in another quarter, a larger quarter, where they operate in indigenous languages, it has remained because African rulers just stepped in the shoes of European colonizers and kept everything the same way. So what has protected African languages is poverty, contrary to what you find in other places. This is how we have to think about these things. And if we really want to revitalize endangered languages, we need sound ecological approaches. And speaking more to people that control the systems than to the people that are affected, and creating situations where the affected populations can really earn a living in their indigenous languages. These are the kinds of things that we should be doing. Okay. And when you think about it, languages are not the same thing, the only phenomena that we find in this situation. Think of our religions. Christianization has endangered indigenous religions and eliminated many of the indigenous religions. Why don't we worry about them? And think of medical practices. We say that medicine has modernized and so forth. Nowadays, people are thinking, yeah, there's something in indigenous medicinal system that we have to revisit. Maybe we should preserve all this. This is quite important. Look, how are we building houses? A lot of modern houses are not adapted to the conditions in which they are built. Okay. So having people live in concrete houses in the equator is not really the best thing to do. How can we help the populations not want to live in concrete houses because they will be healthier in conditions where the concrete doesn't store so much heat and make them sick? And you can go on and on and on. So we need to think ecologically in order to save the languages, but in order to save other aspects of culture and so forth. And my hunch is that the dominant discourse in linguistics is headed the wrong way. Producing a dictionary is good for archiving materials in the language. Producing a grammar, that's not even the grammar that is in the mind of the speaker. That's an interpretation of what the mind may be doing. We don't know for sure what the mind is doing. Okay? And if you keep the dictionary and the grammar there, but nobody speaks the language anymore, I don't know if anybody can really revive the language using that, because the grammar may also contain, the grammar produced by the linguist may contain errors. Okay. So, I don't have a real solution. I have an idea of how we have to do it. And my hunch is that it should really be different from what we've been doing now. Okay. So much depends on what problems people want to solve and what is the real issue beyond language endangerment and loss is changes in the population structure, in the socioeconomic system and so forth. And that's where we have to start in order to give the people that want to save their languages an opportunity to save the language. You need an ambient ecology that is favorable to the practice of the language and to its retention. That is really the bottom line. One last subversion, and I know I'm subversive. The internally versus externally motivated change shouldn't really think it. Okay. Very few changes are attributed to external motivation in traditional historical linguistics. It's like languages have lives of their own, and they have their own minds, and they decide what is going to change, and that is all internally motivated. And then the language comes in contact with another language, and there is room for another language to influence the language, but only minimally. And only a bunch of exceptions can be associated with external motivation. Well, who makes the changes in languages? It's the speakers or the signers. But their anatomies are external to language. But their minds are external to language. I can't think of any more important actuators of change that don't lie in the minds and the anatomies of the speakers and in the socioeconomic structures in which they operate. This is not to deny that there are internally motivated changes, but when we put things in perspective, we should reverse the order. A minority of internally motivated change versus a majority of externally motivated changes that are caused by the practitioners of the languages, and they are the ones that feel the different kinds of other ecological pressures. And if those pressures drive the changes that are being made. And what can be an example of internally motivated change? A good example is how we use, English speakers use the verb go as a marker of the future. Okay. And something says you cannot just use the simple verb go, you have to put it in the progressive. I'm going to go. Okay. But because the verb is in the progressive, you shouldn't say, let's say in standard English, I'm going to go. There are constraints that come with it. If you have going, you must have an auxiliary, be, preceding go, preceding go. And you cannot just say, I'm going to go. Because what follows is a complement of direction. You must use a preposition, and that preposition is not going to be for or from or whatever. It's going to be to, and so forth. So this is internally motivated. But the choice of go is not internally motivated. It's motivated by other factors. Okay? Like knowing that a verb of motion can be used also, verb of special motion can also be used for temporal motion, which is what the future is. And then you explain things that way. And this is, from my point of view, a consequence of thinking ecologically and separating things in different ways so that we can come up with more plausible explanations. Okay. So, in sum, humans are the most direct external ecology of a language. Humans filter other external ecological pressures that affect the languages through their minds and through their will and feelings and through their anatomies. So we have the power to resist change. And some of us, we have seen it in other populations, they don't want to go with the flow. They think that everybody else is mistaken. This is the way it should be, and we do it differently. These things happen. In the case of colonization, one can invoke a cascade of ecological factors. And one of those is natural ecology, the climate and topography. That will determine what kind of economy you want to develop in the area. Okay. There's a good reason why sugarcane was not cultivated in temperate colonies. It wouldn't grow. And the economic system determines whether or not you can afford segregation. And if the economy is very strong and the ruling class is strong, even if the ruling class is a minority, you can afford segregation. Although it also depends on whether the ruling class has a critical mass to survive in a segregated neighborhood. Okay. But population structure really becomes very critical after it is generated by the economic system. Is the population segregated or not? Is it stratified? Are there differences based on gender and age? Are there professional differences where you have to use a specialized jargon for your profession? These are the kinds of things that we have to take into account. And they are all filtered through the human, who can resist or ignore some of the factors. And these are the kinds of things that happen. And we always have to think kind of globally in checking what factors apply and what factors don't apply in a specific ecology. The immediate actuator of change is the human. Thus, most changes are externally motivated. Part of the human role in this lies in generating variation on which ecology works to produce change. So, one of the things I have proposed is that the rules that are usually spelled as A becomes B in the environment of C. Okay, should be A prevail over B in the environment of C. In other words, A and B were in competition. And sometimes the competition is not resolved, and you have, say, two pronunciations for the same word. Okay. So we are not mentally and anatomically identical, despite Cartesianism. And we do not need react identically to ecological pressures. While there is convergence that produces communal norms, there is also divergence that generates individual/ideological differences. Part of this is obvious in language shift, which is associated with language endangerment. Not everybody participates in the shift, especially not at the same time. Shift occurs gradually in a population. In this context, we can think of linguistic ecosystems, thinking of languages as competing for resources which lie in the users, and not as engaging in wars with each other. Languages don't go to war with each other. It's speakers that bring languages in contact with each other. And it's the ecologies that determine which language is likely to prevail. So metaphors like killer language are definitely poorly chosen and inadequate because they don't really direct you to where the action lies. Languages do not kill languages. It's the would-be speakers of science that do through the choices that they make. And next one. Yeah. Press again. Thank you. This is how the ecology rolls the dice on language evolution. And I thank you for your attention.
So you have questions, or we are open to questions now. We can also make them in Portuguese and we translate them. Bom, vocês podem fazer em português também as perguntas que a gente traduz.
Questions, comments, always welcome. Yes. There's another one here.
Well, this is good afternoon again.
Yes.
Thank you for this great afternoon, Professor Mufeni. I really got struck by your last sentence when you said that the term killer languages are poorly chosen. And I've been studying, the English as a lingua franca for a long time. And this is a term that I come across very often. Linguists like Dave Crystal have used this term. So I would like you to expand a little bit on this discussion. Why you think, killer languages, the term is poorly chosen?
Okay, as you remember, I also said I conceive of languages as technologies by self-domestication. And languages have no independent agency. Languages are shaped by the people that practice them. So You can say the population killed their language by neglect, but that is not fair because the population didn't do it deliberately.
Mhm.
The population is just a victim.
Sure, sure.
So it's the conditions under which languages are endangered and die that are responsible for what is happening.
Mhm.
And that's why I want to underscore the role of ecology. And we have to change the ecologies in which the languages are practiced if we want to either slow down or stop language endangerment and loss. And so languages, because languages have no agency, they cannot be killers.
Uh-huh, uh-huh. So then it's a poor metaphor, in your opinion.
Yes, it's very inadequate. It's like putting the blame on the wrong thing.
Mhm, mhm. Thank you.
Questions? Comments? Let's see.
Anybody wants to say Sally is crazy?
I have a question, but I want to ask it.
Yeah, I think we can have, do you hear? Do you hear?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm curious. This is the first time I've heard this ecological framework, lens, and language meshed together. Is there acceptance of this? Is it becoming more of a popular framework? Is this something that people are pushing back on? Is there friction in the academy using this framework and your ideas regarding language shift and evolution?
If you read the literature on language endangerment and loss, you will come across the term ecology so many times, very frequent. I have popularized the term like Peter Milhoisler has popularized the term, but we owe it to Einar Hogan. And there are two other people that did it 2 years earlier than him. I'm trying to remember the names. But anyway, and we do not all agree. But I'm flattered to see that there are more and more people coming my way.
What is the friction that people, or the argument people have against it? That's kind of what I'm curious about. So.
Well, they have not picked up on it yet,
Yeah.
or they are not really working on this particular topic, so they don't have use for it. But if I talk of Peter Milhoisler, who has also developed, among the people that developed the other side, other interpretation of the ecology of language in terms of ecolinguistics. And what I have told Peter Milhoisler is he focuses more on the moral obligation of people to change the situation, but doesn't really explain what is happening. And me, from an ecological and evolutionary perspective, I want to explain how things are happening and why they are happening the way they are. And that is really the approach that I have adopted. And there are, especially when people do Creoles, there is a large proportion of Creoles that have adopted the ecological approach, though they will not agree with me on all details. This is the kind of thing that happens. And I think part of the explanation for this is that scientific communities are just like regular social communities. So people don't engage in change at the same speed, at the same time. And we just have to wait what will happen. And I told somebody interviewed me about 4 years ago, we are in a market of ideas, and I'm selling mine, and if I get more buyers, so much the better, otherwise we'll see. But it's not a game of popularity, it's a matter of what really sounds plausible. And if it sounds plausible to you, it should sound plausible to other people too. but there are going to be people that will exist for different reasons, and I'm not going to get into their reasons. Unless they can disprove what I'm claiming, and we need evidence, and I produce my evidence. I'm waiting for counter evidence.
So, more questions, comments? You don't have it, you can finish for today. And remember, if you want to talk about your research with Wayne, you will always get part of this time, and you can talk to me. Can I tell him? So, thank you for being here today, and we're waiting for you tomorrow.